We've all seen the very grotesque and disturbing footage of Officer Derek Chauvin pressing his knee onto the back of the neck of George Floyd. For those of us who are Christians, it's deeply troubling to see how someone could so cold-heartedly murder another human being. Anyone with any sort of a conscience is deeply troubled when they see the footage. Personally, I found it repulsive and very hard to watch. Regardless of the background, regardless of past crimes or the circumstances around it, the taking of another human life in cold blood is despicable. Because of this, much outrage has been sparked. Protesting and looting throughout the entire nation is occurring, sometimes at the expense of lives of other human beings. Everyone sees that there's a tremendous problem, and it takes no astute observations to realize that this is something that has been boiling below the surface for many years. It's not just the single killing of George Floyd, but rather that there is a deep hurt that has been in the hearts of many Americans for many years. But today, we're not going to look at the politics involved in the killing of George Floyd and the response for our government. How should a believer examine and respond to this crisis in America today? Many have used their constitutional right to protest and to address the government with their grievances. This is absolutely their right. But what should we as Christians have our focus on? I submit to you that our focus should not be on protest, although it's fine and good for Christians to do that, but rather our focus should be on prayer. The Bible often reminds us of our duty as Christians and as followers of Christ to pray. The Bible tells us to pray without ceasing. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 18 it says, "Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints." We as Christians are not called upon to primarily protest. We are called upon to raise these issues unto God in prayer. We're not called upon to kneel about the guilt of others, but kneel in confession to God for our own guilt. That is what we're called upon to do. How should we go about this prayer? As the streets are filled with tightly packed people protesting, we as Christians should not be afraid to meet together in prayer. Sometimes we must stand with Peter and say we ought to obey God rather than man. Praying without ceasing doesn't stop simply because of fears of a very real and very scary threat of the coronavirus, but we should be seeking God all the more on behalf of our nation. All throughout the New Testament and the Old, we are told to seek the face of God in times of trouble. This is the primary response for Christians in the midst of this crisis that America is facing. Another route many people have chosen to take is rioting in the streets. Christians are not to riot. Christians, yes, they sometimes must stand up to a government that is going completely against God and His law, but Christians must primarily return to God, not riot. The Bible tells us in 2 Chronicles 7 and verse 14 that if God's people will humble themselves and turn from their wicked ways and seek His face, then He'll hear from heaven and forgive our sins and heal our land. I believe everyone that is a reasonable human being knows that America desperately needs healing in this time, and that healing isn't brought about by riots and adding to the violence, but rather that is brought about only by returning to God. He is the one that will heal our land, not we ourselves. The sad reality is that people have taken a just cause, and they've taken very real concerns and real wounds and used it for their own gain by looting. But we as Christians ought not to loot, but to love. The Bible gives us an example of love, perfect love, love that commendeth itself to us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And we are to have that love for others. The greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength. But the second greatest commandment is like after that, and that's to love your neighbor as yourself. For many who don't know the Lord, and even sadly so many who do know the Lord and are Christians and are followers of Christ, they are looking to a good policy for a solution, regardless of whether they think it's some form of affirmative action or defunding the police or whatever they think that good policy is. Maybe it's to dominate the streets, as we've heard in recent days. I'm not talking about that. The only thing we should be looking to is God's providence, not a good policy. The problems that Americans face right now will never be solved by man's ideas. What Americans desperately need, and what Christians desperately need today, is a return to God, and a return to His will, and a return to His ways and His wisdom and His strength. We as believers must realize that the devil is fighting because he knows that his days are limited and that he will be defeated. And we have to understand that he's rejoicing when Christians aren't meeting together. He's rejoicing when Christians are looking to policies and not to God. And so we as Christians must redouble our resolve to look into the Lord in this time, and to trust Him, and to seek Him, and to love one another as we ought to. All politics aside, we must practice the presence of God and trust Him to be our strength during this time, and to share His love and His truth with those around us. That's the answer to the crisis of this day.